Welcome to the RBA Today, the Responsible Business Alliance's online news program. I'm your host, Laura Landrow, and today I'm joined by the RBA's Vice President of Public Policy, Bart Devos. Bart, thank you for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Laura. It's great to be here on the show.
Now, Bart, during the RBA's annual European conference in May, a major topic of discussion was the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Could you tell us about the directive and what leading MEPs had to say during the conference?
Sure, Laura. Yes, I can. So this EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, this long name and acronym of CSDDD, is really just that concept, that much debated EU legislation to introduce an EU-wide legal obligation for companies to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence in their supply chains, possibly even in their value chains. It was proposed by the European Commission back in early 2022. EU member states then backed the concept around the end of last year. And now, just in June, the European Parliament was set to vote on the proposal. So, as you hinted at, it was really exciting to have at the RBA European Conference actually the very MEPs who are leading this file in the European Parliament on stage with us. And I think that those MEPs were a good representation of the different political perspectives of those laws, between those who focus most on how do we make this legislation ambitious on companies so that we protect people and planet, and then those who focus on how do we balance that sustainability ambition with keeping all of this also realistic for companies. And I think that the main takeaway from the discussion at our conference was that those different groups are all partially happy and also all are partially unhappy with the compromise which they made on this law. So they all had to give in on certain wishes which they had, but they also all thought that the deal which they made was a good compromise. And I think that the most interesting part of that discussion was perhaps to see how, on some of the most sensitive topics, sometimes when we get granular, when we get specific, the positions are not that far apart. Some of our discussions clarified, for example, that harmonized legislation across the EU can really be a good thing if that EU level standard is ambitious, if it is well designed, if it is effective. We also saw that at this point in the discussion, both the progressive and the conservative politicians actually agreed that industry and multi-stakeholder initiatives and schemes play a very important role in the implementation of due diligence and that this should be reflected in the directive. So in summary, to conclude, I would say that it was really exciting to see on one hand the passion and the convictions of these MEPs, but on the other hand, also their willingness to make compromises, and especially that some of RBA's key asks are situated at the very intersection between those different positions.
Interesting. And what is the RBA's position on the directive? What would we like to see included?
So RBA has actually been involved in this discussion since before the European Commission published its proposal for this law. From the very beginning, we've had public positions on which our engagement on this file is based, and that engagement has really spanned across the different EU institutions and at all levels. The bottom line of it all is that we support the policy approach of mandating due diligence. We think that it is positive that the EU sets an EU level framework so that we create really a level playing field across the EU. And we do have a few key priorities on how the directive should look like. First of all, we really want the due diligence duties to be based on existing globally recognized international standards, such as the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD M&E guidelines. And that really is because those standards have proven to be effective. They are the source code of the current government and industry efforts around the world in our space. And they already clearly define key concepts, such as what is risk-based due diligence and what is the responsibility of a company. So in other words, we ask EU regulators to not invent new concepts, but align their due diligence duties that they now put in EU legislation with those existing standards. Second, we want to see harmonization, and that really just very simply means we want to make sure that companies across 27 EU member states have to play by the same harmonized rules. And we understand that there's sensitivities around that you cannot fully do that, but on key provisions and concepts and duties, we want to see harmonized rules. And then third, we want to see a smart reference to the role of industry schemes. That means that on one hand, you recognize that the most effective and the most efficient way for companies to tackle complex issues and their interconnected supply chains is through industry collaboration. So that means using collectively developed tools, harmonized standards, using shared leverage between companies. But on the other hand, that means companies are and remain individually responsible and accountable for their due diligence duty. So membership of an industry scheme should not provide safe harbor to companies. That's what we call smart reference to industry schemes. And when you put those elements together, that's when we believe that you have the recipe for legislation that is at the same time ambitious, effective, and delivering positive impact, but also efficient in terms of being workable, implementable, and enforceable for authorities.
Great, thank you for sharing. The European Parliament finalized its position on the directive on June 1st, and trilogue negotiations are currently underway. Can you talk a bit about that process and what happens next?
Correct. So basically, to make new EU legislation, you need three key EU institutions on board. That's the European Commission, you could say the EU's executive branch, then the EU member states, and the European Parliament. So since the European Parliament finalized its position on June 1st, that means that all those three institutions now have backed the law, they have formed their own position on the law. So now they start negotiations, closed door negotiations, during which they negotiate the final version of the law based on their own positions, trying to agree on one final version. These negotiations often take a lot of time, and this is also probably going to be the case for this law, given the level of sensitivities. It is actually well possible that we don't see a finalized text until Q1 2024. Once the negotiators succeed in signing off on a finalized text, then there's a couple further important steps. First, the EU member states and the European Parliament will pass kind of like a final vote to formally adopt the law, after which it will be published. And then the EU member states will get a certain period, probably 2 years, to transpose this EU directive into their national law. So each EU member state will have to formally integrate this directive, this EU directive, into their own national law. And we are probably talking normally 2 or 3 years after the law is finalized, the law will take effect and companies will have to apply those rules.
So, what are the most important things that companies need to know about the directive as it stands today, and when will it go into effect?
Yeah, so the directive, based on the kind of like steps I just gave, will probably likely start applying to companies either 2 or 3 years after it's finalized, expected early next year. So that means most likely in 2026 or shortly after. I must say that while it is unpredictable how the final law will look like exactly, there's a couple of important elements that are crystallizing and that companies should look at. First of all, under this directive, most large companies active on the EU market and some mid-sized companies as well will become responsible for conducting human rights and environmental due diligence across their supply chains and possibly across their value chain. Um, this means that you really become responsible, legally responsible for doing due diligence over your direct suppliers, indirect suppliers, and possibly beyond. And this for the main human and labor rights, such as think of forced labor, child labor, decent wages, safe working conditions, as well as for key environmental standards. Second, while the precise content of that specific due diligence duty is not yet known, most likely it will follow the concepts of the UN guiding principles and the OECD MNE guidelines. So companies can prepare by aligning their policies and practice with those standards, and most likely directionally, they will be pretty robustly ready for whatever comes out of the EU standard. Third, in addition to this generic due diligence duty for key human rights and environmental issues, the directive will probably also include some related obligations. For example, in the area of climate change. In the area of climate change, it will likely mandate that companies set and implement targets in line with the ambitious Paris Agreement. And then fourth, it is very likely that the final version of the law will also introduce liabilities. And that means that's the concept that companies will be liable for human rights and environmental impacts in their supply chains under certain conditions. So in addition to being responsible, legally responsible for doing due diligence, they could be held liable for negative adverse impacts happening in their supply chain. So it's safe to say that due diligence will no longer be a matter of paperwork or check the box protocols. Companies will actually be liable for their suppliers' due diligence, and therefore they will have high stakes in ensuring the effectiveness and the maturity of their suppliers' due diligence.
And following up on what you just said, how can the RBA help member companies meet the expectation and likely requirements of the directive?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I will say it's a journey for all of us, and this is an evolving matter. But it's safe to say that what is coming at us is an impactful wave of legislation, and it is important that companies proactively get ready for what's coming. There really is a variety of ways in which RBA can help here. First of all, it's clear that members should analyze the legal obligations that they'll have to meet. So members can follow RBA's policy briefings, information channels, to get the latest information and detailed analysis of what those laws mean for them in practice. Then second, when it actually comes to the actual implementation, that is where RBA standards and tools are extremely valuable. The directive explicitly recognizes that companies can use the collective tools provided by industry schemes to support their individual due diligence efforts. And you all know, as RBA members, that RBA has a wide variety of such tools, ranging from our risk assessment tools over our worker voice capabilities to our GHG emission tools and so many more. Third, one crucial element of the directive is that it makes companies responsible for due diligence at their suppliers, including suppliers down in the value chain. So it is therefore important that companies start building capacity of their suppliers now and start really working on the maturity of their suppliers much more than already is done today. And therefore, the RBA actually also developed a training product to help RBA members train their suppliers to understand those implications of mandatory due diligence legislation for suppliers. We have already been training suppliers in over 5 countries, and members can contact us if they are interested in this. But I would say that beyond all of these specific points, it's just really important to note that the legal obligations that are coming at us are very ambitious. Implementing all of this will be burdensome, and it is really by working in the collective that we can be more effective and more efficient in delivering on all of that policy ambition.
Again, thank you, Bart, for joining us today and for the information on this important legislation and the RBA's related efforts.
Thank you, Laura, for having me.
Thank you, and we look forward to providing additional updates in future episodes of RBA Today. Thank you very much for your time.